Okay, as I said, Mr. Robert Brose, he's a longtime colleague of mine who I literally met this far away in our little suite at the NIC, the National Intelligence Council, while I was working there in the private sector capacity. But he is the former Deputy Intelligence Officer for cyber. At that time, Mr. Brose just returned from a joint duty assignment. He was special projects for U.S. Space Force underneath or within the ODNI executive representation seat. And then you also were the former director for the NIC for the Strategic Futures Group.
Director for Tech Futures.
Yeah, okay. And before DNI, where he's spent a long time, he was at DIA, and he also was, he actually started his career, I guess, the beginning of your career, not far from where we are at the Quantico Cyber Hub for the Marine Corps intelligence activity. Robert, welcome, and thank you for offering your leadership and your lead for the panel, which I do want to highlight our panel guests briefly. Again, you'll get a packet, and we have bio links for a full bio. But we have, dare I say, good friend from Department of Energy, Nick Andersen. He's now the Chief Operating Officer at Invictus International Consulting, but he also served formerly as a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. We have Daryl Haegley. He's a Technical Director, Control Systems Cybersecurity, Department of Air Force, with multiple roles under the Office of OSD, including Cyber Principal Advisor. He's also the former president of the OPSEC Professionals Society. Tom Goldberg, he is a principal and co-founder for Patriot Tools, and he's an author of federal laws governing DoD information communications technology, supply chain security. And Michelle Watson, a very dear colleague, she's a senior fellow at the Danube Institute. In fact, we're switching roles. Michelle had me on a panel at the Danube Institute not long ago in Budapest, where we also discussed cybersecurity and some of the threats and trends in Europe. But Michelle is also a former advisory manager for cyber and strategic risk at Deloitte. She's the founder, past CEO of Cyber Intelligent Partners, vice president for corporate relations, and the former director of the Cyber Intelligence Initiative at the Institute of World Politics. And she's also a former VP, vice president for British Telecom, specifically their BT managed services. Each of you will be given some time to talk more about what you've done in the past. And I'm going to hand this over to Robert, who I know is very capable, given our past work together. I think it was the National Press Club. And we looked at ICT in Africa out of all topics that we could imagine. So Robert, I'm going to hand it over to you. In fact, I'll switch chairs if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, all right.
And why don't we start? Well, we'll just start the way I'm looking at everything here.
I'll start talking while we switch. Actually, I can stay here.
Ready?
Stay there because you've been driving. Let me stay here. I'll lean in.
Okay.
So first,
without further ado, Robert will begin.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to the Gold Institute for the opportunity to be here, for pulling together such great people. I want to absolutely say thank you to Jeff. He and I have done a lot of great adventures, and we probably don't have time or the appropriate setting to describe all the important things he did for us on our team. But thank you. It's good to be sitting beside you again. One of the challenges for me coming to events like this is people raise so many interesting questions, some of which I have thoughts on, some of which I can't say in these settings. But the beauty of this is we have such an illustrious group of panelists that I'm sure that they will illuminate our thinking and challenge our thinking, give us a lot of different ways to look at these questions. I'm going to ask that as each of you speaks, you tell your own story, you provide your own perspective. Don't worry too much about the guideposts that I'm about to give. But if you can, if it strikes you as overlapping what you wanted to say, if you can talk about what you're seeing in terms of what I'll call the 3 Ds. One is deterrence. We heard earlier Dr. Chilufo talk about deterrence and whether or not it's really holding. You know, are you doing things, or do you see adversaries or your own organizations doing things to deter? The second D would be deny. to prevent an adversary from being able to harm you in cyberspace or gain access to you or disrupt you, right? So if we have D1 is deter, D2 is deny. The third D would be disrupt. What are you doing to actually disrupt an adversary who is not deterred, who you're unable to deny, and then they get in? Are you able to disrupt, or do you see your governments or your partners being able to disrupt them? If we have a chance in the Q&A, I'm going to ask about norms, but for right now, to give everyone the most time possible to provide their perspective, please let us know what you have to tell us, and think about, again, the 3 Ds: deter, deny, or disrupt. And then should we start off with Jeff? Are we doing this down in the order of the speakers? Are we starting here with Dr.
Yeah,
we're going to start
Nick.
with Nick.
Yeah.
Nick, please lead off, Nick.
Sure. Well, thanks everybody for being here, and thanks for having me. Jeff mentions my previous role over at Energy. So I like to try to, when I'm having these conversations, I like to focus on critical infrastructure and critical infrastructure specific issues. Normally, for a less cyber savvy audience, we kind of give them a much more broad scene setter. But really, everything that I've tried to focus on is really about getting people to imagine waking up tomorrow to find the things that you always think are going to be there when you flip on your lights in the morning. Imagine the power grid is offline. Critical communication networks have been severed. Our sensitive national security information has been compromised. These really aren't plots of novels anymore. It's just the reality of this sort of gray space warfare, this modern cyber warfare that we see exemplified by Salt Typhoon as an example, with this sort of extended campaign that the Chinese are engaging in. It's really well beyond being a wake-up call at this point, and should be shifting our minds to full battle cry. Their strategy is pretty clear. It's about undermining American sovereignty and exploiting our reliance, or in some cases over-reliance, on technology, with an aim that's not really just disruption. It goes to a fourth D. It goes to domination. This is a relentless campaign that makes one thing clear: we have to act decisively to be able to deter, deny, and disrupt adversaries like China. When I'm thinking about deterrence, it's really about our ability to impose consequences so severe that our adversaries are going to do more than think twice before acting. They won't even consider acting. This really means making clear that cyber aggression is going to be met with retaliation, whether that's economic sanctions, targeted offensive operations of our own, or some diplomatic isolation. We have to stop reacting to threats and start setting the terms within the space. Second D, deny. It's really about making it as hard as possible for enemies to succeed. It's really going to require a complete overhaul of our cybersecurity posture, hardening our networks, modernizing our supply chain, removing vulnerabilities like Chinese hardware and software from within our critical infrastructure, and closing the door on these easy targets. And disrupting is more about taking the fight to our adversaries. It's about not sitting idly by any longer, waiting for the next breach. Our cyber forces need to continue to be empowered to proactively dismantle foreign threat networks, neutralize malware campaigns before they reach our systems, and really strike at the very infrastructure that's enabling these attacks. So as many of us who are working as cyber professionals here in this discussion today, serving on the front lines of that undeclared war, whether it's leading these efforts or being hands on keyboard, these really aren't just theoretical approaches. They're actionable strategies, but they do require unwavering commitment and leadership and making some hard decisions that we haven't been able to make as recently, at least in my opinion. But really the challenge for us is kind of clear. We have to safeguard our future by confronting these threats head on. Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon continue to be sort of those large warning sirens going off in the sky. This is just a precursor to much larger war. And we have an opportunity today to kind of discuss how we can fortify our nation, our security, in this sort of era that we're seeing of cyber conflict.
Nick, thank you. I think we're going to have a little bit of time to get into this in some Q&A. I'm going to hand it over to Tom in a moment, but before I do, one quick follow-up question as we sort of phase over. Are you feeling like you spoke very strongly about disruption needing to happen? Are you seeing it happening or not?
Within our own infrastructure, seeing disruption within our
No,
own
the disruption of the adversaries that are coming at you.
Sorry, can you say it again?
do you feel like the adversaries that are attacking your infrastructure are facing disruption or not?
No, no, I don't. I'll give you a very quick example before we move on. In the last day or next to last day of the former Trump administration, President Trump signed an executive order that would have been focused on targeting the malicious use of IaaS, of infrastructure as a service resources that were U.S. based by foreign adversaries. You know, they were using our own laws against us. We were seeing that these were US based IPs and they were taking advantage of spin up, spin down resources to spin up, launch malicious campaigns and spin them down before we could take action. That was rolled back. Where we would have had some know your customer requirements in place. We really wouldn't be able to target adversary C2 in a way that we had not. So no, I guess to answer your question, the short way, no, I don't see us really disrupting their infrastructure in a way that is significant and makes steps over the long term to make us more secure.
Thank you for your honest take on that. Over to Tom.
Well, thank you all. I am just a little overwhelmed with the unanimity of opinion. I certainly didn't anticipate this. I sometimes feel, and Joel can tell you this from many, many years of working together, as though I was a lone voice crying wolf and seeking some solutions. But to get right to the point of D1 defend, I think it's broken. We can't any longer defend because the threat is hardware based. It's not software any longer. And all of those designed in flaws are being exploited. To deny is to be the remaining option. What we have to do is rip and replace. We have instituted that in 3 successive appropriations for cellular networks that are basically deployed in the middle of the country and bought ZTE and Huawei equipment. With regard to disrupt, there are things that always go on. I think in the first panel, we were discussing that in terms of how one characterizes that. And basically in the realm of espionage, we certainly have not been shy and things of that nature. And you could go right back, if you will, to the Iranian, if you will, operation that we undertook to disrupt the various equipment that they had in their nuclear program. So we're not shy about that. The kinds of things that I see is really affecting us, and I have to give that first group out of Auburn a lot of credit. I was unaware of how thorough their work was, but I very much agree with pretty much what they said. Is that all of our current efforts to leverage our partnerships with the private sector run afoul of some of our political and, if you will, business leanings, and that is that the private sector owns these assets. They do only that which they must to keep the asset up and running at a nominal level using TAP and other related processes and procedures. And in the most recent iteration of the establishment of a partnership program where we funded Cybercom to $12 billion, and remember that money was appropriated in March of last year. No sooner was the money appropriated than the companies went to the White House and told President Biden they didn't want to have a relationship with a combatant command. So the mission of the enterprise was shifted to CISA, but the money stayed at Cybercom and got shifted to international partnerships rather than the domestic funding in certain areas. So that's an illustration of where things kind of go off the rails a little bit. And we have an obligation to enlist our private sector partners into a bit more responsibility, pretty much along the lines of what the Business Roundtable initiated in October of 2019. That is that the responsibilities of companies extends beyond their shareholders to the communities in which they live. And in this case, if you're an electric utility, your charter, which forces you to maintain your ability to operate. And that's not really being honored as much as not. Now, I know a lot about that. I visited with 60 electric utility C-suites in 2024 and had lots of discussions and really very little progress. The second one is that I think, and this is in keeping with what we've heard earlier, that the new administration really has to accelerate what is really the product of 2024 decisions by the Biden administration, which is essentially to require either through Secure by Design, which is a hardware-focused program, or is Secure by Default for software, the requirement that we buy equipment and systems that are essentially safe for our use. There was a debate when that was rolled out on the 7th of February. I'm going to geek on you. I know the exact time of day as well. When Ann Neuberger announced this at an AI conference and had a debate with Barbara Humpton, who's the CEO of Siemens USA. And in their exchange, when Barbara Humpton tried to say, could we phase it in across, you know, a kind of a criticality assessment, and to which Ann Neuberger shook her head and so said, absolutely not. I want baby monitors and the most sophisticated equipment used by industry to have the same level of security. And I think that's somewhat indicative of a direction. And I very much appreciated that shift in direction because Ann Neuberger fought me and Bob English for years over keeping some avenues open for counterintelligence purposes at the expense of the cost to the economy. And you may not be familiar with this, but in 2008, I helped write a speech that Keith Alexander, then director of NSA, gave, in which we detailed $1 trillion a year in losses. Now, at that time, that was 5.7% of GDP. It hasn't gotten any better. And so what we really have is a need to accelerate some of the programs that have been put on the books, as I said a moment ago. In particular, there's a very good option to begin to accelerate and broaden the application of rip and replace. This is a law that was brought in by Deb Fischer and Senator Hickenlooper of Colorado, Deb Fischer being from Nebraska, that has gained a great deal of currency among leadership in the House and the Senate and among the rank and file members. And that gives us kind of a lever that we can use to push programs forward and the like. My last comment is that I'm a strong believer now in the issuance of a national emergency declaration by the incoming Trump administration. I urge President Trump to do that so that we have the legal mechanisms that will allow us to compel certain actions to be taken that allow the private sector to pass those costs down to users. In particular, it allows us to overcome the need for public utility commissions to give authorization to electric utilities and others the authority to increase their rates so that those costs that they're going to absorb in these kinds of actions can be offset. That's about it for my comments.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. A lot to chew on there, and some very concrete ideas of how activity could be taken to disrupt or deny. We're going to go now to Michelle, as I gather Jeff's going to get ready with some slides for Daryl. But Michelle, very pleased to meet you. I'm told we have similar accounts that we've paid attention to in our careers, and we'll look forward to your take on these issues.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Gold Institute for inviting me. It's nice to see some old friends. When I think about these questions, I'm going to be speaking from my current perspective, which is born out of the fact that for the last year I've been on assignment based in Budapest, Hungary, working for the Danube Institute, which is a think tank, but specifically focusing on geopolitical strategies and risks within the public-private partnership. That is, how are governments and industry organizations working together? What is their take on cyber, emerging technology and innovation throughout the EU and Central Europe, right? So looking at it from that standpoint, and as an American, interviewing companies in the EU and Central Europe and government officials, I think of, first of all, what you said, deny, or what I would call deterrence. What I've seen is we're doing an awful job at it. And I think this is not just the U.S. and Eastern and Western Europe. I think all the global, let's say, Western countries are doing a very bad job at it. And I think it's because adversaries, the attackers do not see consequences. They know that the consequences, if there are any, the benefits far outweigh the consequences. So long as this continues, we're going to see a deterrence that is wholly ineffective. And Frank mentioned earlier today something, and I totally agree with, is that we have to do a better job of not only telegraphing that we have harsh responses, that we will in fact use them. And then this kind of leads me to my next point. When you talk about disruption, again, I don't think we've done a very good job. We, being Western countries, we've not done a very good job at disruption. And however, I think China and Russia have. And both from a Chinese cyber standpoint, Salt Typhoon and the recent telecom breach with that just being one of many examples. And we know in terms of disruption from a Russia standpoint, vis-a-vis the Ukraine war, yes, but the disinformation campaign that has been waged by Russia in the wake of the Ukraine war has been very effective and has been very disruptive. And I think this is where we have a tremendous amount of work to be done to become more effective. And I think one of the reasons why we are so bad at this deterrence and disruption on a global basis, and I say not just the U.S., but U.S. as the former beacon of the world in this space, if you will, and less so under the current and soon to be let's say previous administration. There's been a dearth of leadership. And then one of the things that we see is the biggest risk going forward in 2025 is what we call a G0. It's not a G7, it's the G0s. There are no global leaders in this space. Not in a way that is disruptive or deterring our greatest adversaries. And I think that if you look around the world, you look at the weak and failing governments. South Korea, the UK, Germany, France, Canada. There is no strong leader. And one reason why I say this with a bit of kind of optimism in my voice is because we see now that with Trump coming in, we see more than just rhetoric, but we see where our adversaries are starting to think, okay, now not only is there a new sheriff in town, but there's actually going to be some consequences that we fear. We fear that we believe that there's going to be leadership in this. And we know that when there are geopolitical crises, that businesses, governments are weakened by the lack of any strong leader. So I think we're going to see where the Trump administration is going to give us some much needed leadership. And I think it's going to put nation state adversaries and your criminal organizations and everything in between on the spectrum a little bit more on, maybe I'll put them a little bit more on defense. And yeah, I think that's my initial thoughts on all of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I love that I wind up with a panel where people aren't pulling their punches and are giving us some fairly energetic takes on this issue. And I'm looking forward to the little mini resource drill that I'm going to spring on all of you in the question and answer period. But before we get there, I want to turn it over to Daryl, and we've got some slides for him. So please stick with us as we keep going here.
Daryl, I'm going to try to share screen.
Okay. Yeah, so I really appreciate that. Again, the Gold Institute, and then being up on this panel with these other esteemed folks. Feel very privileged for that. And since I've been working with the DoD for about 14 years, it's almost impossible for me to talk without PowerPoint slides. Just kidding.
Can you see
But
these,
I
Daryl?
do need. Yeah, I can. It's got
Okay,
the
perfect.
it's got the slide plus the next slide visible, just
Yep.
so you know. But that's fine. Just wanted to throw some context out there, and I do need to couch that my comments do not, officially represent the department at large there. So as an official record, but I want to bring to you 14 years of working and trying to promote OT within the Department of Defense. I thought it was a great example by the chief of Space Force, is that you cannot, if you want to take out things in space now, you can affect it by attacking the ground station, and we've seen evidence of that. I think, though, what we've seen is from a deterrence perspective, we've not seen people understand that this alignment and these dependencies. Next slide, please. And it's been mentioned before about Volt Typhoon, and that we had a number of senior leaders stand up and say, "Oh my gosh, this is really important. This is where they were. They were in Guam," and and I hear a lot that, Daryl, hey, this attack in Guam, Volt Typhoon, you should be getting a lot of resources right now, and everyone should be throttling about this, but not at all. Everyone's like, well, Guam's a rainbow unicorn and at the tip of the spear, so we expect that, and so we'll just deal with that. But and then there was also a recognition that U.S. Cybercom doesn't do critical infrastructure defense. They don't have any OT defenders. That's not their mission, is to go to every base and defend. And I think there was a realization that came upon folks is, oh, we need to figure out who will do that. Who will be those people who will deter, deny, and disrupt adversary activity to try and get in there. Next, I really like this slide. It's a publicly available slide, and then these slides will be made available to you as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this just captures in 6 months the attacks on infrastructure systems, as noted there, across the United States. Those from Russian and Chinese, and again, 6 months all over the United States. And this still does not create this impending need to do something yet, right? So it's just like, hey, we recognize, a lot of the Department of Defense has water systems, power systems, fuel systems, whatever, you would imagine we'd have, that are the same, that are commercially available. Yet, we are still bifurcated on who owns and promotes these. So, the IT cyber people don't run the OT networks, and the OT system owners and people run that don't own cyber. And so, as I see an industry getting a chief information security officer, which was mentioned earlier, that's critical. And that person is now taking on IT and OT. We're still not there yet within the Department of Defense. And then lastly, I really liked the next slide, please. So some people were talking about that next dynamic that we still have not really exercised with, that we're starting to explore here in the Department of Homeland, in the DoD, is contested homeland operations, right? So we know that, yes, they're going to continue to try and get into our systems. And then how do we, if we agree that's going to happen, then how do we defend against it? And then not only how do we operate without it, right? How do we operate without power coming on the base? But what if we have disruptions and degradations on the base, which is another issue that confuses this, because when you say critical infrastructure, most people don't think about the stuff that's on campuses, on these bases. They only think about what's off the base. But then also add an extra part of disinformation. What if you have to come to work and everything around you is all these information about how the school has a a shooter, hospitals got ransomware, first responders, or has, other things going on. And then you have to now go to work and help defend what's going on in the installation when you're surrounded by disinformation. We are looking for ways to bring all that together to train military members so they understand how they can fight and continue to move through this. And that's all the slides I had. I just wanted to continue just a little bit more on what has been the department's initial response on deny, disrupt, and deterrence. Well, that's simply to disconnect, right? So there's this feeling out there that, hey, we just don't, Daryl, we don't need any of your cyber stuff here. We'll just disconnect everything. We'll disconnect the little cord there. We'll run over, we'll press the green button, and we're good. Can't do anything to us. And that is really how a lot of the strategy is right now, because we don't have OT cyber advocacy. We don't have tools in place to determine whether an adversary is on those networks. And the people who are going to be running those aren't cyber savvy. So, and I can say that we've talked about this publicly, almost 80% of the Air Forces and Space Forces OT is disconnected. You have to take a laptop and walk it over with a security stack on it, plug it in and run it. So that's considered disconnected, right? So anyway, so from what you asked, that is our strategy, is to disconnect right now.
Can I just amplify on that very last point?
Please.
The urgency of disconnect was made in recommendations by IEEE, by the Department of Energy, by Department of Defense, to their contractors, to the advice in a regular, if you will, FERC and NERC guidance given to the electric utilities in the fall of 23 and through the spring of 24. That was recommendation number one, to segregate and disconnect. And that is one of the strategies which amplifies the point that we're at a very critical state of vulnerability, and that recognition at least gives us a building block upon which to carry forward with some of the recommendations we heard earlier.
Well, and just to follow up, and I'm all for it. If you say that's my plan, and then I'll ask, well, how often have you rehearsed that plan? And that answer is never.
Never.
Right. So that's fine if that's your plan. But if we've never done it, and every time we disconnect power from a base, the generators don't do well, and we can't operate independently, that's still not a good workable strategy.
I'm gonna pause here because I've got a little drill for you before we take questions from the audience. And I think we do have a lot of questions coming in. But I'm gonna first, before we get to that, I'm gonna do a little snap drill for you, right? The last part of my question for you, and we'll incorporate it in this drill, is to what extent do you think international norms regarding cyber really have a value or a utility? And the way we're going to tease that out of you is I'll ask each of you very quickly, imagine you have 10 coins, whatever currency you like. They could be gold, they can be Bitcoin, whatever. But you have 10. And my question to you is, what do you put them on to solve this problem? You're not constrained by existing policy. You've got imaginary better policy in the future. What do you put them on to solve your problem? And do any of them go to international norms? And we'll run in the order we did. We'll go Nick, Tom, Michelle, Daryl, really quick.
No, I don't put anybody on international norms. International norms are all BS. It doesn't matter. International norms are only respected by the people that we don't have a problem with. So all it does is further constrain us. And I understand that that's not a popular opinion in all circles, but that is my take, given the success or level or lack thereof that we've had in the last couple of decades of doing this. If I'm taking 10 coins, I am re-architecting the approach that we take to DoD's approach to defending the homeland, and looking at that and saying that is the only scope and scale approach we have to a workforce to be able to reasonably refocus on how we actively defend critical infrastructure within the homeland. And legally, we have the authority to do so under a task force structure, and USDC can waive reimbursement under the Economy Act in order to be able to do so. and partnering more closely with National Guard forces and state and local governments to do that. Entirely re-architecting and getting to a point where we are preparing and testing for when a bad day happens for the employment of those forces.
Thank you. Tom?
I couldn't agree more with Nick. If I could quote from one of my lawyers, we're in violent agreement on that particular point. But I'd like to just quote from Bismarck and then copied by Willy Brandt when Nixon confronted Brandt for talking to Brezhnev. And he didn't like that, given the fact that we were supporting much of the defense of Western Germany. And the response was, well, I have to deal with realpolitik, which is the reality on the ground today. And disengagement is our reality today, pretty much exemplified by some of the examples I gave you earlier. Let me amplify on two others. HHS issued on the 5th of December new HIPAA security rules for, if you will, personal health information is the way they characterize it, which requires total encryption of everything. Second is that it was issued on the 7th of December that the FCC will be attempting to write regulations for the telecommunications industry to harden their systems, both hardware and software. So I think that the trend line is towards that independent, non-international process. And I think that we are benefited by that for two reasons. One, we have this very, very large, probably the most integrated internet ecosystem in the world, and we become the most appropriate test bed to figure out what we need to do, because we have as much diversity within our own country having to do with the infrastructure and its architecture as you might find in the whole world. So we are the best test bed. Second, if we're going to implement, as we wrote into the Chips for America Act, that we have a standard called measurably secure. That's in section 9903. I know it's there because I put it there myself. And in the context of that, if we're going to use those kinds of standards as a mechanism to measure what is secure by design or secure by default, we ought to test it in our own laboratories and our own test beds first, so that we know that the systems, in fact, can be relied upon. I would rather do that than have any international norm configuration where we just don't have control over the processes leading to an evaluation.
Interesting. Thank you. Michelle?
Well, to be in also violent agreement, if I had 10 coins, I would put absolutely nothing on international norms. And a couple of reasons why. Number one, for the last year, I was participant and presenting at a number of EU conferences and committees and commissions and on various topics around innovation and technology. And I have to say, it seems that the only organizations that seem to respect international norms are the ones that are creating them, like the EU. And to Nick's point, that they're already they're the ones that are going to be conforming to it. It's the adversaries that don't. So the international norms aren't really helping anyone. I think it gives organizations like the EU, United Nations, it gives them a soft, fuzzy feeling that they're doing something. The fact that it's a waste of time and money is lost on all of them, but certainly not, I think, doers like us. I think of the public-private partnership and where those have been successful, and government organizations and businesses that work together effectively on cyber deterrence and cyber defenses. I think that's where the money should go. Not just in the US, but particularly in the US. But international norms, I mean, there's a lot of international norms. Let's just say climate change, for example. We don't even have agreement on the definition of a lot of the norms, let alone agreement in terms of adherence to it. So that's my response in a nutshell.
Thank you. Daryl?
All right, you've asked for it. A dissenting opinion. So
All right.
I think three coins go to updating our contracts and making sure that the vendors are held accountable and are responsible for the upgrades and the updates and the security stuff. I mean, how that's still not part of these contracts is one of the failures that we have. I would put 2 coins on outsourcing a lot of this cyber stuff to the civilian sector with some sort of oversight or reporting by the government, because we are just not going to come up with the right people. So we've got to figure out a way to do this remotely, I think. I put 3 coins on accountability. If it's not DHS, then who? But right now we don't, as we take all the IT cyber infrastructure incidents and we all report them, but we don't do it for OT. DHS puts out all the OT vulnerabilities, but we don't report back to DHS. So this is a complete lack of visibility there. And I think that's something where we need focus on, and that's not a monetary fix. That's a procedural fix, and we could do that. And I think absolutely we need a focus on norms. Where is the right line, right? So I think the good example is the Ukraine situation. So when a cyber attack is going after Ukraine's critical infrastructure, is that acceptable? What level is acceptable? That it goes out for 24 hours, is that cool? So what is the norm expectation there? I think these are really important. I think we need to come up with them more regularly. We need to have the agreement. I think Michelle is spot on that if you take 5 years to come up with a norm, that's not a norm. That's not workable. But we need to come up with what those lines are, what they're not, and understanding whether someone is giving a jab or a takeout punch from a cyber perspective.
I love that we got a diversity of opinion here. I love it was so eloquently articulated. I'm actually looking forward to talking to you all about some of this in future events. But let me first ask, Jeff, do we have some questions from the group? Because we've got a lot of people with a lot of different backgrounds on here. My own state government is here. We've got people from all over the world. Do we have anybody who has a hand up in the chat?
So I don't see any hands.
I'm going to encourage people who have a question. We're going to wait about 10, 15 seconds here. This is an amazing opportunity with an amazing panel. As everybody who knows me knows, I can talk all day. I'm not going to. We've got other people here at Quantico that could ask questions, and I'm sure our panelists can all iterate with each other. But I do want to give the people who have been kind enough to hang with us through all this to come in the chat with any questions. So I'm going to count to 10 seconds here while we take a look at, let's take a look at the chat and see if we have some questions coming in.
And it could be related to where I put my 10 coins on my pet initiative that we've talked about quite a bit over the years, Hackback, and looking at some of that tiered corporate responsibility and defense.
Do we have any, I'm going to go to Joel, but
I
do
think
we have
I
any
saw a
questions?
hand. John Wolstead.
John, John's got a hand. Good. Good. John has got a hand. Because I want to engage the cyber audience out here. John Wolstead had a hand up.
Joel. Is it Joel?
John, keep going to your left. There we go. John. Oh. Yep, John. And John, please unmute.
Mute yourself, please.
That works. Okay.
There we go.
I think we have an unusual opportunity here because these subjects have seen some concord even in the last 4 years between the Biden administration, the Democrats and Republicans. And you now have, of course, a president coming in who's going to be a very different kind of president. And that gives us more of an opportunity. And we also have another ace in the hole, and that is the 21st century Churchill. And I speak of Bibi Netanyahu. And it will be a lot of collaboration between them on that sort of thing. And if some of the European countries are not turning around, Israel is ready. And I think they can accomplish a lot there. But I would add also, just in general, that there are habits of thinking that get us into these situations. And there are 3 of them. One is we have a habit of declaring holidays from history. The second is that we sometimes declare peace dividends. And the third is that at various times we think we can go home. And some of the nominees that Mr. Trump has up there are in this, particularly for the DNI, that we can come home when in fact our adversaries don't do any of those things. If we go home, they will fill any vacuum that we leave. And on the other two, they don't take holidays. They're there 24/7. And Dean Rusk had a wonderful quip about this. He was a great Secretary of State in a not so successful pair of administrations. And that was in the 60s. He said, at any time around the world, 1/3 of the sleep of the world is asleep, 2/3 are asleep, and 1/3 is up to something. And so we need to get into a mindset that we don't get to take holidays.
Do any of our panelists want to respond to that? Before we have another question up from Joe, but before we go to Joe, I want to see if any of you want to respond to that.
I couldn't endorse that more. Again, another case of violent agreement, and especially on the point of history. I just want to remind everybody, and I'm old enough to have lived through this, I'm 71, but our first major attack on an electric utility occurred against Florida Power and Light within weeks of us making available internet. And the attacker was a graduate student from the University of Finland. I want you to remember how long ago that was. The other thing I'd like to comment about is 1971, and you can't get this report anymore, it's been removed, but Carnegie Mellon University published a critique of the design of the x86 by virtue of the fact that the architecture that was contained in that chip was highly vulnerable to exploitation. And I think maybe it was, and I'm guessing here, maybe it's an editorial comment that's not worthy, but I'll say it anyway, but maybe that report was purchased and then, round filed. But the point is, we've known a lot about these vulnerabilities and these weaknesses for so long, but we've been really unwilling because of market growth and innovation and what have you to tackle them. And the expense for us to do that today is enormous, into the trillions of dollars. And not that we can go back in history, not that we should shame anybody in the past, but we have to be the responsible parties today to move forward in whatever steps we can take to correct these, using history as a guidepost.
I used to, thank you, I used to program hexadecimal on 8086 chips and make them jump through hoops by pushing different values to different memory registers. So yes, indeed. Anyone else on that, or we're going to go to Joe Weiss? I see with a hand up there.
I have just a quick thing to say, and that is, I love the reference about history, and we all have heard, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And then history does repeat itself. Or in the words of Mark Twain, if it doesn't repeat itself, it certainly does rhyme. So we better pay attention.
Great, thank you. Joe, I think you're going to be the last question because I've got to keep us on a tight schedule here. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this. But Joe Weiss, or I hope I'm saying your last name right, up there we're going to pull you up there and let you ask your question to this group. And then hopefully we might have one last question from Quantica. We'll get one from Quantica, but right now, Joe.
Okay, number one, thank you for allowing me to do this. And it's really 3 comments. The first is China's cyber attack Cal ISO in 2000. So you want to go back to what's been going on. I know because I was at EPRI and dealing with that at that time. Number 2, we can't make secure control systems. And part of it is because the network security people and the engineers won't even work with each other. The third point is we can't be resilient when we have absolutely no cybersecurity, authentication, or cyber forensics in anything we measure. So if you can't trust what you're measuring, we're talking pressure, level, flow, temperature, voltage, current, motor speed. When we can't trust any of that, you do not have any resiliency. Oh, by the way, you don't really have much safety either. We've made almost no progress since I helped start the Control Systems Cybersecurity program for the electric utilities in 2000. That's a pretty damning statement.
Thank you, Joe. I actually have some friends who work in that field trying to solve that problem, but since I'm here on the clock, I don't know if I can do an individual shout out, but I assure you there are people out there who share that concern, and there are some folks in the private sector and in the government who are paying attention to it, but clearly a lot of work to be done. I'm gonna turn over to Joel here, who's been very patient. We're gonna give our last question out of the Quantico Cyber Hub here, something that is set up in the state of Virginia that allows people to come. I believe there's a range in this building. Am I correct?
Yeah, there's a range.
There is a range, but let me let you close out the question. But again, thank you to everyone on the panel.
So I started here in '87 when I saw the first IBM group systems, and I was part of the multi-agency group innovation, and that became the multi-agency joint intelligence integration center. Joint is a bad word up here, but my question is I've experienced a lot of monitoring, aggregation, analysis, and reporting. And then I say, well, what about the response? And over the last few years, what's scary is people are, ringing the bell that we've got a problem here, and they set it up SOCOM and everywhere else, and we sit on it. How are we going to improve our response capability?
Panel, please.
So I just think we got to make sure that we know who the right person is accountable, right? So if we know that this person, if there's a problem, gets pulled by the ear to report why did this happen, and what should we have done, or what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen, then that's one way to get there. Because right now, especially from the OT cyber resilience side, we still have yet to make that determination. Should the logistics people or the infrastructure people pay for the cyber, or the CIO and the cyber people pay for it? Literally last month, I was briefing the Secretary of the Air Force, and I said, these budget numbers are uncertain. And he said, why? Doesn't the CIO own cyber? And I said, absolutely, Mr. Secretary, but they are not funding it. Right. So Joel, I've heard your concern with this, and a number of those different entities is somebody has to be specifically held responsible, have the authority, and just be held accountable.
Yeah.
Right. Other panels here.
Yeah, could I just amplify a little on what Daryl said, because I think it's an excellent point. The CIO has abrogated all responsibility over the history that the CIO office has been in existence, and it's a fairly new office within the Department of Defense. But they have uniquely gone to exemption, exception, authorization for all of the known flawed devices that come. I'm not going to give you a defense example, but I'm going to give you an energy example. There is a product called an inverter that is used for going from, if you will, AC to DC kind of activities, principally used in solar and in wind, so that we can match with what has to go over transmission lines. Do you know that virtually every motherboard for every inverter sold by 12 multinational companies is made in one factory in Guangzhou, China? Because we, in addition to what Daryl just said, we have allowed our supply chain to winnow down through subcontracts and subcontracts to single suppliers. And IEEE gave out a warning a couple of years back that basically said you have to rip that out and replace it, because all firmware updates have to originate from within China. The control of that, if you look at the universe of everything that's out there for inverters, is in one country's hands, and we have allowed that to atrophy. So what do? How do we get to the point that Joel wants to reach to? And that we wrote into the CHIPS Act. We wanted to if you will, repatriate the ability to produce on U.S. soil those things that we needed, without which we could not maintain our sovereignty or our economy, right? We haven't fully implemented it in the way that it was written, but it is at least a start, and its mission is to bring back all of that to the United States. Once you do that, you can also then impose some of the things I said earlier, which is to establish standards like measurably secure. And for those who are not familiar with that, that's a process we used at the Los Alamos National Lab, where you had a triple audit. Somebody who had their hands in a glove box working on something was audited in real time by somebody standing next to them, that was audited by somebody standing behind that one, so that we wouldn't lose even an atom of material. These kinds of process and procedures exist. We just choose not to use them. They're expensive. They fall on the expense side of every account. And what I would like, I'll just throw it out there, is assume that we could convince the public that something that meets a standard like that is worth having. It's safe for your use. And maybe we can create a whole new dynamic. And I know this is a bit fanciful, but as a 71-year-old, what more can I do but be, you know, to fantasize a little bit. But in the context of that, could we not make a market out of having something that meets these new standards that would propel you know, innovators in the marketplace to produce something that the market might want? I'll leave you with that.
Understood.
Yeah, and I think
Michelle,
No, I did not have a comment. I just realized I was on mute.
oh,
No, sorry.
okay, all right.
Sorry about that.
Nick,
I'll give you a quick, I think it's really about focusing on comprehensive frameworks that focus on speed, coordination, and adaptability for response. We need things like centralized incident command, you know, with pre-delegated authority, so we're not, you know, trying to learn on the fly and coordinate on the fly. We need actual real substantive public-private partnership and fusion of operational threat pictures. Advertise things that are based on, you know, AC/DC themes and going and standing on stage and dancing around with Rubik's cubes. I'm sure makes people feel great, but it doesn't actually do anything. You know, we should be taking things like those joint collaborative efforts and really focusing them on, you know, more mandated threat sharing and being able to get to sector specific response that is, you know, tailored and coordinated in a stricter way with those critical supplier security requirements, automated threat hunting, and getting to more proactive resilience and stop waiting for the attack. You know, we can't
Oh
continue
man.
strategy. You know, we've got to get to more offensive operations, automating that threat hunting, and, you know, building our own architecture in a preventative way, in a zero trust focused way, to limit those opportunities for lateral movement when we inevitably are attacked. Being able to get to sort of training and response readiness, so those mandatory exercises and the better education and recruitment and the cyber reserve force that, you know, the secretary was mentioning, those are good, important points as well. But it's also going to require some legislative and policy reform. There's only so much you can, you know, the unitary executive can take on. There's going to be some things that the legislative branch is going to have to take on. And a lot of it, we're going to need to fast track additional emergency authority to be able to take immediate action in response to cyber incidents and to be able to mandate more liability protection for rapid action.
thank you all very much. I would love to talk to you more about this. I know
Well
our
said,
audience
Nick.
has gotten a lot out of it. We're going to have to move on now to our next VIP speaker. Thank you all very much for being part of this panel, giving me the opportunity and our guests the opportunity to hear your great ideas. Thank you. Over to Jeff.